The sermon for this morning is entitled Calm, Confident, and Competent. The other day I told my grandson Andy about a video I recently saw. Andy's a musical fellow, kind of like his granddad, only with more talent. He sings and plays several instruments. His favorite instrument is the piano. So he understands, like I do, how stressful it can be to perform in public. I have one advantage over Andy when it comes to coping with the stress. Over the years, I have had the opportunity to make countless mistakes and failures while singing, playing, or speaking in public. So I'm used to it. I don't get so stressed as much as I used to. Back to the video. The video is of a brilliant pianist, Eliane Rodriguez, performing on a huge stage in front of a huge audience. Well, she sits down and she starts her concert performance, and one of the pedals on her piano broke. Now, I don't know a lot about that. I don't play the piano, but it's the one on the far left, and if it isn't working, if it's down and it won't pop back up again, I think was the problem, then whatever she played just continued to ring on as long as the strings would make music, so that she was playing on top of what she already played, and it just kind of gets a rumbled up mess. So she demonstrated the problem to the audience, and she asked her companions to help her. She needed a new piano. But in the meantime, she says, why don't we just have some fun? So she starts playing various things on her broken piano. And she's laughing and having a good time playing it. And then some men come onto the stage. And she just continues to play on this broken piano as they push her and the piano off to a special part on the stage, build a fence around her and the piano, and while she is still playing, the piano starts to lower down slowly, and she's playing and waving as the piano goes down further and further. There's a momentary silence. And then the piano starts playing again. As she comes up, she's waving and smiling and playing her brand new piano. They take down the fence around her and push her and the piano back into the center of the stage, still while she's playing, and then she begins her concert piece. Very impressive. My point for Andy was that the amount of composure that she demonstrated under extreme pressure, it was amazing. In what could have been a very, very stressful situation, she exhibited calm, confident, and competent composure. I'm sure you would agree with me that stress is a significant killer in our society. Stress takes a terrible toll, doesn't it? I can testify to this in my own life. Stress and the way I dealt with it nearly destroyed me. One failed marriage and a heart attack later, and I began to understand better ways to deal with stress. So here I stand before you, 35 years old, and hardly showing signs of the toll that stress took on my life. In our gospel lesson today, we find Jesus in a particularly stressful position, and frankly, his life was only going to get more stressful as time went on. This story about the miracle of the loaves and fishes is a very familiar one to all of us. As a matter of fact, did you know that this is the only miracle of Jesus that is reported in all 4 of the Gospels? Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John thought it important enough to give us their accounts of it. And every preacher you have ever had thought it was important to preach about it. You are familiar with the most great themes that have been derived from it. One, offer a little to Christ, and he will do much with it. 2, Christ himself is the bread of life. He is food for the entire world. And 3, some seeking to relieve the story of its supernatural elements simply see the story as an example of sharing. There are many great themes to preach about here, so here's old Al. I'm not really 35 years old. Here's old Al trying to find a new twist on this old familiar story. So I said to myself, hey Al, don't stress about it. Jesus was under a whole lot more stress than me, and he handled it. Maybe we can learn a lesson from that. Like I mentioned before, Jesus was in a particularly stressful position at the time. His friend and cousin John the Baptist had just been beheaded by Herod, and Jesus wanted to withdraw to a solitary place where he hoped he could be alone. But great crowds followed him wherever he went. Instead of taking time to mourn, rest, and regroup, he felt compassion for the crowd, and he healed their sick. As evening approached, the disciples came to him and said, "This is a remote place, and it's getting late. Send the crowds away so they can go to the villages and buy themselves some food." But Jesus said to them, "Verily, I tell you, the restaurants are closed because of the coronavirus." No? Well, talk about stress. It already seems like it's been 2,000 years since this pandemic started. What Jesus really said was, they don't need to go away. You give them something to eat. The disciples were befuddled. "We only have 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish, they answered. And he said, "Bring them here to me." And he directed the people to sit down, taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, and looking up to heaven, Jesus gave thanks and broke the loaves. Then he gave them to the disciples, and the disciples gave them to the people, and they all ate and were satisfied. And they picked up 12 baskets of leftover broken pieces. We're told the number of those who ate was about 5,000 men, besides women and children. When we take into account those women and children, it's safe to say that Jesus had to feed between 10 and 20,000 people. That seems pretty stressful to me. I think this story illustrates 2 different ways to react when stressful conditions bear down on us. One is the approach of the disciples. The other is the approach of Jesus. Have you ever noticed how rarely in the Gospels the disciples are shown in a favorable light? It seems to me if I were writing one of the Gospels, I would want to make heroes out of the disciples. After all, these are the people who were responsible for giving us the church. We desire to emulate the disciples as we strive to be disciples ourselves. If they had not been faithful to the Great Commission and God's call after Christ's death and his resurrection, you and I would be heathens today. But the Gospels show these men with all their faults. The disciples often seemed frightened, even terrified. They are almost always stressed about something or other. In this story, they are worried. 10 to 20,000 people have come to hear Jesus. It's supper time, and they're in the middle of nowhere. What will they do? Are any of you worriers? What would you do if an extra 5 people came for supper, much less 5,000 men with their families? Talk about stress. What will they do? Food doesn't come out of thin air, you know. Well, okay. It did during the Exodus. That's another story. Sure, the disciples had cause to be concerned, but what we need to see is that this is the way they approached every problem. They were worrywarts. They lived by fear, not by faith. They were much like most of us. Do you know anyone that gets almost frantic when they are caught in heavy traffic? Auto safety experts claim you don't save much time by speeding in traffic. People who tailgate, wind in and out of traffic, jump every light, and keep their foot on the accelerator rarely arrive at their destination more than a minute or so earlier than the person who drives calmly and safely. Then why do people drive this way? Anxiety. Stress and anxiety weighing on their minds constantly. They're not trying to be obnoxious. They can't help themselves. They don't even know what it is that's eating at them. They only know that if they stop running, something dreadful will happen. Henry Ward Beecher said, "Every tomorrow has 2 handles. We can take hold of it with the handle of anxiety or the handle of faith." Let's see how Jesus handled problems. Let's learn from the Master. First of all, Jesus handles this stressful situation with confidence. The anxious disciples suggest that Jesus disperse the crowd so the people can go back to town. At least they could get something at Sheetz. But Jesus said, "You don't need to send them away. You take care of it." Spoken like a true leader. You take care of it. Jesus spoke with confidence. People were amazed because they said he spoke with authority. But you might say, well, that was easy for him. He was the Son of God, you know. But after all, aren't we God's children? Why do we allow our fears to drive us? Howard Thurman used to tell about how impressed his grandmother was with the preaching that she, a former slave, had heard from a slave minister when she was a girl. the slave preacher was allowed to come to the plantation and preach about 4 times a year. And on each occasion, he had drilled into the consciousness of all of his hearers the notion that they did not have to feel inferior because they were slaves. He always ended the message the same way. "You," he would say, as he fastened his eyes upon them. You are not slaves. You are God's children. Can't you imagine how those children of Africa stood taller when they heard this man of God speak? And so should we stand tall. We too are children of God. Jesus came to every situation with confidence, not from his physical strength or from his appearance, but because of his relationship with God. Confidence is ours also when we rely on our relationship with God. Jesus handles this stressful situation with calm. The disciples are frantic. "We only have 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. They say to him, Jesus says, "Bring them here to me." And then Jesus did a very simple thing. He directed the people to sit down. Have you ever noticed what a calming effect it has on people when they sit down? Sometimes the best advice we can give to people is be still. Sometimes that's the best advice we can give to ourselves. Be still and know that He is God. A man was seated beside a pond when he accidentally dropped a coin into the water. He poked around with a stick in an attempt to separate the coin from the stones. But this stirred up so much mud he could see nothing. Not knowing what else to do, he sat quietly for a while. Then, glancing down, he saw clear water again, and he saw his coin. Sometimes the best thing we can do is quit running around frantically and just sit down or kneel down and compose ourselves and commune with God. Jesus showed his confidence and his calm. But he also showed his competence. He blessed the loaves and multiplied them. He fed the people. He fed the people with both spiritual bread and physical bread. He healed their bodies and he healed their spirits. People flocked to Jesus because he could get it done. There's nothing that gives us confidence and an inner calm like being competent at a task that is important to us. The boss who is most difficult to please is the one who feels least secure in his or her position. One way to relieve the stress in your life is to be competent in the areas that are important to you. If you have so many tasks that you are unable to do any of them, well, cut down. Prioritize. Strategize. Make your time count. Cut out time wasters. Make lists each day. Do first things that are most important, regardless of how distasteful they may be. You will be amazed at how much stress you can remove from your life. Finally, I'll add one more factor. Jesus had companions. We assume that Jesus spent so much time with his disciples because he wanted to train them to continue his work after he was gone. Well, that's certainly true, but maybe, just maybe, Jesus also counted on his disciples for friendship and emotional support. The University of Pittsburgh psychologist Thomas Kamerick asked 39 college-age women to begin with a number in the thousands and count down by 17s. Don't try it now, or you won't hear the rest of this sermon. But try it sometime. It's really difficult. I tried to start with 1,017 because I gave me a head start. It still didn't work very well. Well, he instructed these women to do that, and he told them to hurry up about it. This was stressful to them. Most experienced significant increases in heart rate and blood pressure. Then they were asked to do this drill once more, but this time they were allowed to have a friend with them. Both tests affected the women's cardiovascular systems, but having a companion reduced the impact by half. This should not surprise us. We need friends to help us to keep from coming unglued. Of course, Jesus' most important companion was the Father. He fellowshipped with his disciples and he fellowshipped with God. No wonder his life, though lived under the most stressful conditions, was still relatively stress-free. He brought to each task these essential elements: confidence, calm, and competence. And we add companionship, like the hymn we sang earlier this morning, "What a friend we have in Jesus." We can turn to Matthew once more for our conclusion. Chapter 6, verses 25 through 27. "Therefore I tell you, do not worry about your life, what you will eat or drink, or about your body, what you will wear. Is not life more than food, and the body more than clothes? Look at the birds of the air. They do not sow or reap or store away in barns, and yet your heavenly Father feeds them. Are you not much more valuable than they? Can any one of you, by worrying, add a single hour to your life?" It's a good question. Amen.